This is Georgina Rose, and welcome to the Postmodern Iconoclast, a podcast that helps you destroy and break the false icons and idols of the digital age in search of a more authentic esoteric spirituality. On this podcast, we discuss ideology, esoterica, and everything on the fringes of mysticism, religion, and related topics. Welcome to the show. On this episode, I have Schizotopia back. If you are new to the show, he was on our first episode, which is really exciting, and he talked to us about hyperreality. And there was one thing that we sort of, right after we finished recording, we were messaging, and I was like, we should have discussed this, and he was like, we should have discussed this, now be hyperstition. So brought Schizotopia back to discuss hyperstition, what hyperstition is hyperstition real, how hyperstition can be used. I feel like hyperstition relates to chaos magic in certain ways, so I wanted to sort of talk about that as well. But basically, we're going to talk about everything hyperstition, what it is, what does it mean, and all those things. So, Schizotopia, I feel like you don't really need to introduce yourself, but I guess you probably could if you want to.
That's you know who the fuck I am. Whatever. I think people we've had enough drama now that I think people know who I am.
Yeah, I feel like most of my audience is pretty aware of you at this point. But if not, Schizotopia makes memes and runs a meme page and a podcast. So first, I feel like we need to start with like what is hyperstition, which I think is kind of the bulk of the show, but really I feel like where we should begin is like, where does this term emerge?
If it predates the CCRU, then I'm not sure, but I'm pretty sure hyperstition, because it wasn't just Nick Land who was talking about it, but basically Sky Nick Land, who if you talk about, you get in a lot of trouble. Speaking of hyperstition, Sky Nick Land and a bunch of other cybernetically inspired weirdos in the 90s at Warwick University in the UK, they had their own little extracurricular club called the Cybernetic Culture Research Unit, CCRU. And according to the CCRU does not exist, never will exist. And whatever. They had this idea of hyperstition as being sort of like superstition that's real. Or you could say that, I guess the easiest way to explain it in today's language would just be memeing things into existence. That would be hyperstition. You know, I don't know if you guys remember Femboy Hooters, but people talked a lot about Femboy Hooters as a meme of Femboy Hooters, and then somebody actually tried to create a Femboy Hooters, which, you know, I don't think it happened, but the point is, if it had, that would have been a really great example. But you could think other things. Maybe what's another one? Szechuan sauce. Rick and Morty. I have a feeling that your demographic, your audience, are very familiar with Rick and Morty. Rick and Morty had that whole thing about McDonald's Szechuan sauce, and people started showing up and demanding that McDonald's bring back their Szechuan sauce until they finally did it. I would see these things as acts of hyperstition, but I think there's another way you can think about hyperstition. And that is that things from the future are already present now. And there isn't necessarily a perfectly rational way to see it. Instead, you can kind of see little nodal points, is what William Gibson called it. Little nodal points in culture. Little things between fact and fiction that give you a glimpse into the future that you wouldn't be able to put together in a logical, causal way, but it's there nonetheless. And I think if you look at a lot of science fiction writing, it's animated by this kind of spirit of prophecy, where people are talking about the future in ways, or depicting futures that are deeply irrational, or that you couldn't necessarily arrive at from logical deduction, but end up being kind of accurate nonetheless.
Yeah. And I remember when I was first kind of reading about this stuff, I looked at it and had the kind of CCRU terminology everywhere, which if you sit down after this to read some CCRU stuff, which I guess I would recommend doing, it's a very, I would say, almost psychedelic experience looking at it. And it's kind of, the terms are unique and they're sort of within that confine. But once you sort of get it, it does make a lot of sense. it is a little bit crazy, but it does make sense once you kind of accept the craziness and sort of lean into it. But yeah, I think there are many times when things have been sort of memed into existence. I think phrasing it like that makes it immediately make more sense because extremely different things. But when you mentioned the time thing, which was your second definition, that kind of gets into some of the even weirder stuff with Nick Land and the CCRU about time that can get really wild really fast. Because if hyperstition exists and it relates to that time thing, that sort of breaks a lot of our normal understandings of how time works.
Mm-hmm. There's a passage in Land's probably most famous essay, Meltdown, where he talks about Deleuze and Guattari and says all the way back in 1972 they were describing the cybernetic internet future, um, implying that they were describing the future without actually knowing it. That they were speaking the language of the future already in their philosophy, um, but weren't aware that they were actually describing the future. Um, at least that's how I interpret it. And to
Okay.
me, that would be a form of hyperstition.
It almost reminds me of, and this is kind of a weird tangent, but it reminds me a bit of the whole manifestation language in a very strange way, right? Like when you look at
Yeah.
people who discuss manifesting things, there's this sort of like, if you speak something to existence, it becomes real. But there's also this sort of darker version of that I see among younger people, that if you speak a negative event or you panic about a negative event or you start talking about it, you're going to manifest it and speak it into existence. And in a sense, that's sort of the like Crystal Girl version of hyperstition.
Well, exactly. But the one thing would be is that you look at a lot of old classic superstitions and you see how even if you have a completely materialistic worldview, you can see how a lot of these old superstitions have come to life through the internet, through technology, through telecommunications. So like there used to be all this fear about warding off the evil eye, right? And if you catch too many evil eyes, people you can experience great misfortune. People might think that you're a witch or a no good Nick or whatever, and they'll turn on you and this sort of thing. And if you think about how gossip and pernicious behavior or pernicious gossip online can snowball into people getting canceled and stuff like that. It's I think that too. There's a hyperstitious aspect to that. Look at this. What's going on with this actress, Sydney Sweeney?
Oh yeah, for those who don't know, this actress Sydney Sweeney, she's a actress in Euphoria. She previously said some really interesting stuff where she was alleging that the sort of producers of Euphoria were kind of pressuring her into doing certain sexual scenes. She was a little uncomfortable. Basically, what happened is recently she went to her mom's birthday party, and you can see in the background of one of the photos someone wearing like conservative memorabilia way in the background, and she got a lot of pressure online to essentially like cut off her family because of
Disown her
it.
family for being whatever Republicans. I mean, what it felt like once again, it always feels very much like a witch hunt. It always feels like this kind of return to a more primitive time where if someone even has whatever any relation, any no good Nick to the third degree, that they need to be cast out.
Which I always find that whole thing weird because the paranoia that underlies cancel culture, the idea that there are people hiding in the bushes with bad ideas, that's sort of dependent on those people actually existing. And so they kind of do, in a weird sense, want those people in the world so that they can witch hunt. Like they want.
And they end up creating them, kind of like I was talking about before we started recording. There's a lot of liberals who don't really understand what socialism is, but they now identify as socialists because the Republicans say that if you believe in uh, any kind of welfare state, you're a socialist. You're basically the same as Lenin and Stalin and Mao. And they go, oh well, I do believe in a welfare state, so I guess I am a socialist, this sort of thing. Or even talking about calling people accelerationists, and accelerationism equals terrorism. And once that meme was out there, people who did commit acts of terrorism would identify themselves as accelerationists. So they go, oh, accelerationist equals terrorist? Well, I want to commit an act of terrorism. I'll just call myself an accelerationist.
Yeah, and it does create this sort of self-fulfilling prophecy where, something gets sort of discussed so much, it gets kind of sensationalized, and then it sort of becomes real. It's spoken
Mhm.
into existence.
I think in a bigger picture with hyperstition, I would say capital begins to bend time. I think that's an important way to think about it. If you think of capital as condensed time in a way, it's an amount of labor time that produces amount of value that's, abstractly quantified as a certain amount of money. And then it gets even more abstract when you get into finance, and then even more abstract when you get into cryptocurrency, and so on and so forth, right? That capital itself becomes hyperstitious. Capital itself begins to become spooky and quantum and semi-omniscient. If we think about the way, I mean, everyone has experienced this at this point, where you're just talking about something with a friend or loved one. You're just talking about something, and it'll be something very novel, something very weird, like vacationing in the mountains of Albania. I don't even know if there's many mountains in Albania, but vacationing in the mountains of Albania. And sure enough, you will get an advertisement for an Airbnb in the mountains of Albania, or so on and so forth. Something like this. Almost everyone has experienced this at some point. And a lot of times it gets debunked, and people say, no, that your phone isn't listening to you, your devices aren't listening to you. It's just that the algorithm has gotten so good at predicting what the consumer is going to want next, that it's sending you these advertisements. And what's funny about that to me is that the explanation is way more the official explanation is way more horrifying than the supposed conspiracy theory, because that means you're telling me that these algorithms are so good at predicting what we're going to talk about and want next, that even the weirdest shit, even your weirdest, most abstract desires or conversations can be predicted by the semi-omnipotent algorithm.
Yeah, I'm not sure which is quite more terrifying. The idea
I'd
that our
rather just be
phones,
spied on,
that our phones are listening to us, which I'm still a little convinced is happening. Like, maybe I need to
Yeah.
grab my tinfoil hat. I'm still a little convinced they can sometimes like hear my conversations. Or if the algorithm can peer into your soul and know everything about you. Because if that's true, that means there's a ton of data on like everything you're interested in and everything you do. And that data could theoretically be seen by other people, which is
It,
absolutely
it's
terrifying.
it's able to predict abstract conversations you're going to have in the future, like odd, seemingly random conversations you're going to have in the future. That is way more terrifying than the idea that it's just listening to you.
Have you
Um,
heard the like chaos magic internet theory that the algorithm is an egregore? Have you heard this take?
I've heard a lot of things like it. I think we talked about this a little bit before, but this would also kind of fall into the category of hyperstition, where you start anytime. I think when you're like attributing any kind of subjectivity to algorithms and machines.
I feel like, in a sense, the whole idea of an egregore, which is the idea that our thoughts can combine and become thought forms, and when they become big enough, they sort of become autonomous, is kind of, it reminds me of hyperstition. The first time I sort of understood what hyperstition was after reading about it for a while, it just immediately reminded me of this idea. What are your thoughts on that?
Um, I mean, well, I feel like I gave you my thoughts on this already. uh, because the algorithm is actually predicting the future already, and just making us feel like we're being spied on. That's kind
Yeah,
of,
that would kind of inherently make it an egregore, wouldn't it?
yeah, that's the hottest take I have there. Otherwise, like recently we had that guy in San Francisco who decided that his chatbot was sentient, and there was like a small media there's like a couple news cycles where people were freaking out about this, but then when you actually looked at it, you found out this guy was just really into woo. He was part of some mystical occult church, and he even himself said, he went to his Twitter, he was saying that he just believes that uh he just believes that this chat program, this AI chat program that Google was running, it's his personal spiritual belief that it has subjectivity. And okay, I mean, if it's a matter of personal belief, fine. But what was more interesting about that to me, more interesting than whatever, debating whether or not it was actually conscious or ever could be conscious, so on and so forth, was just that that's the way that the culture is going. Um, when you look at something like QAnon, I would put QAnon very much under the banner of hyperstition, because ultimately I think it was a handful of shit posters, or maybe even just one dude who started the whole thing and basically created a modern day religion. I mean,
Well,
somebody who was making this shit up created an open source leaderless cult, and it was successful enough that there were people actually, storming into the Capitol because of their QAnon beliefs. And then it's even fragmented more, where there's people who believe that JFK Jr. is going to descend from the sky and be the Messiah of America or something, right? And none of these people were given Kool-Aid. None of these people were taken to a camp and isolated from the rest of society. Um, None of these people did anything like that. And yet they were still utterly convinced of its truth, and many of them still are. And even my QAnon friend, like, he started talking about QAnon as being some being that was outside of time, and therefore was able to see through time, and was trying to pull people, trying to create the best timeline possible by changing things in the present. So it was funny, even the like theology of QAnon started to sound extremely Landian and hyperstitious, as if Q is actually like Rocco's basilisk or something, or some kind of like, AI from the future that is currently altering the present for what it wants. And actually, if you want to talk about computer spirits and hyperstition, or something like that, I mean, that explanation for QAnon, that it's actually an AI that's like trying to destabilize. I mean, if you were an AI in the future and you wanted to destabilize the present, you wouldn't send a Terminator back in time. That's a waste of time, right? It's as we've learned in the Terminator movies, it's not a very effective way of changing the future. No, what you'd want to do is go back in time and start a mass movement, probably by manipulating people with the internet.
Oh, yeah, you can do so much. And this actually predates the internet. It's a story that Thelemites might be familiar with, for the Thelemites who have stuck around. Is there's this conspiracy theory that Barbara Bush is the daughter of Aleister Crowley. And this originates from a April Fool's article that was published in the UK. A journalist did this for April Fools, by the way, and they admitted to this quickly after. But basically, they ran a story that was Aleister Crowley is the secret father of Barbara Bush. We have all these photos, all this proof. And they ran the article. And if you read the article, you'd think it was serious. And a lot of people actually believed this article and still do. And this still actually gets cited in a lot of conspiracy theory stuff. And the author of the article itself said, it's like, I released this on April Fool's. This was an elaborate joke. But that conspiracy theory, which it's bunk, it still ended up making an impact, and modern conspiracy circles still talk about it, which in a sense that's a little hyperstitional.
Yeah, but or the idea of like the medium gets to redetermine the meaning of the message, and it's kind of why, like, I'm kind of don't want to make memes anymore, because people, you post something as a joke, people take it seriously, and then through its life cycle, it gets turned into something else completely. And I don't know, I worry about that now. I worry about what I'm feeding into the computer demon.
Well, it's interesting how memes can kind of blur into not memes in a way. Like they kind of can, and with time they can become a little bit less of a meme or a little bit more of a meme.
I mean, stuff I would make. I would make alt compasses. I used to make a lot of alt compasses where I'd try to predict the near future. And I wasn't actually trying to predict the future with any real seriousness, but it is funny how some of them ended up being extremely accurate. You know.
I will say alt compasses are one of the more interesting meme formats. I still like them, though sometimes they can get a little bit real.
It's too much work. It's too much work, and then it stops being funny when they do become real.
Do you think that hyperstition could be used like intentionally to make things happen? Like someone who's sort of listening to this and being
This,
like, why can I not just hyperstition something into reality? What are your thoughts on someone like theoretically taking the idea of
I,
hyperstition and trying to do it on
I
purpose?
think people are doing hyperstition on LinkedIn all the time.
How
You
so?
know, because like fake it till you make it is basically fake it till you make it in the internet age is pretty hyperstitious. Where people lie profusely about their resume. They make shit up. They Photoshop themselves in front of nice cars or whatever. People who basically do a lot of projecting. Okay, people do a lot of projecting, but some of these people, it ends up working out for them. They get that job, they get that brand tie-in. I even think the way that like people who sort of became famous for being famous, and not all of these people necessarily come from money, or even the ones who do come from money, um, they may have had extra resources helping them do this, but the process that it went through was still through a lot of using the internet to project an image of being more famous than they really were, or more important than they really were, and it worked.
That reminds me of this article that went around a couple of years ago where there was this company out in LA where you could rent a set of a private jet. So it's not a real jet, it's just like a set in Los Angeles you could rent and take your Instagram photos in.
Yes, I'm pretty sure I saw this, and for all I know, Andrew Tate got his start on a fake airplane, and now he's actually famous. I don't know. I guess he was a boxer or something, but that even like the crossover from like minor celebrity to mega celebrity, um, I think you could read a little hyperstition into that. How it usually, if you look closely at it, it's um, these people were able to use what limited resources they had to project the image of like being extremely important. Even if you ask the people who like really love them and really stand them, what exactly is it about them that you like? What did they actually accomplish? They couldn't tell you.
A thing that I wanted to sort of ask you about hyperstition is for something to be hyperstition, does it need to be sort of written down or sort of put out in the universe somewhere for it to be like the basis of a hyperstition?
Hmm. I would like to think of it as being like a time loop where the hyperstition is arriving from the future just as it's leaving from the past. Um, it should be a perfect Mobius strip. Um, but in other words, like, does there have to be an intention? I guess so. I mean, otherwise, what's the difference between a hyperstition and just a random set of events?
That makes a lot of sense.
I guess
I
with like with chaos magic and stuff, where people are making sigils and this sort of thing. I know that when people will say when they make sigils that come true, right? Person will make a sigil, which is basically you take some intention or some wish that you have, and you write it down. And there's different ways to do it, but you take out the vowels, and you take the remaining letters, and you use that to draw a picture, and you focus on that picture. Or you burn it, or you do acid and stare at it, or you masturbate over it, or whatever. However you want to do it. There's a great Kenneth Grant It's like great Kenneth Grant speech from I think the 90s online where he talks about how he did sigils while he's coming up on acid in front of a bunch of people that he's yelling at. It's pretty funny. But anyway, I've heard lots of people who have done sigils and their wish comes true, but their wish was already in motion before they even did the sigil. So then did the sigil grant the wish, or was something already going to happen and you psychically intuited that you were going to get that raise or find that $100 bill or whatever, and that's why you made the sigil?
That reminds me of a sort of discourse that happened probably a year and a half ago in the sort of general culture sphere called Intention is Not Everything. And basically, what this came down to is if you want to manifest, do a ritual, do a little sigil, and make something happen, you can't just have intention. So they would say you need to do the ritual, but you still have to, after you've done that ritual, make choices in your material life that would align with the ritual. Basically, the idea that ritual can open a door, but you still have to walk through it. It kind of reminds me of that narrative that went around.
Yeah, if you're praying to win the lottery, you still have to buy a ticket.
Yeah, like the idea is like if you're doing all this stuff to get a job, you still have to fill out a job application. It's not just going to happen.
Yeah, at a certain point, is there any difference between hyperstition and magical thinking? And I would say no, there's not. At a certain point, there's no difference.
Then do you think that people who sort of use the term hyperstition is just sort of another paradigm of looking at things?
I would say big picture, if we're going back to Nick Land, I think Nick Land's view is that the world of capitalism and colonialism, because if you read early Nick Land, if you read Kant and the Prohibition Against Incest and this sort of thing, he sounds like a decolonized neo-Marxist leftist. His view is that capital and sort of like Enlightenment values and Kantianism and this sort of thing, it made this hyper-rationalized, completely quantified, disenchanted world that capitalism basically, projected this hyper-rational reality onto everything. But then the irony of that is that in the process of quantifying everything, capital itself begins to act like a genie. It begins to reintroduce magic back into the world. And we little autistic, rational, Kantian Western people can't handle that. So you could see it as the return of the ancient past or the mythical past through the gateway of the technological future. I think a lot of Landian thought is actually this conflict of there's like actually a singularity through technology of the deep past and the deep future.
So do you think there's sort of with technology, because I think people, when they talk about like the technological future, they think of it as this completely new era, new thing. Do you think that some of those sort of revelations we're having due to the rise of technology kind of previously existed and had been forgotten?
Maybe. I mean, I personally do. I'm not actually really sure what like Land or other people thought about it. It just seems to me like, and this is stuff that like Frankfurt School talked about. We constantly have had paradigm shifts and scientific revolutions, and it's funny when all these new agers, they love to talk about quantum physics, and like somehow quantum physics is going to re-enchant the world. And even people saying like, oh, well, if you look at these mystical traditions, it sounds like they're talking about quantum physics. And okay, maybe they were. Or maybe quantum physics is just our woo-woo mystical language to describe the same things that, people have been experiencing all along. Which is to say maybe our science isn't as scientific as we like to think it is and never was. That would be one way of looking at it.
Well, if you look at the history of like science versus mysticism, this like hard dichotomy between science and mysticism is a very, very modern thing. It's not really something that existed historically. Like back in the day, a lot of the people who were sort of the vanguards of esoteric and mystic thought were considered like scientists. And a lot of, I mean, even into relatively modern times, you see a lot of these people who made scientific breakthroughs having deeply mystical understandings of the world and a deep interest in mysticism. Like the idea
Yeah.
that like rationality and religion are like diametrically opposed and they cannot ever overlap or explain each other is just not true. Multiple scientific ideas we've come to over time have existed because someone was like, I have saw this idea in religion and I want to see if it'll work. Like they're not as hard line opposed as people like to think they are.
It's funny where, I think it was Spengler who said that the Copernican revolution was an act of iconoclasm. The nice little neat cosmos, the nice little neat cosmos where everything revolves around the Earth. That image was shattered and it was replaced with basically this kind of psychedelic cosmic image. And what's funny is like a lot of conspiracy theorists, like flat earthers and stuff, they desperately want to go back to that old icon of the nice, neat, rational cosmos. But it's been shattered completely. And I think that's a good way of thinking about how all scientific revolutions and paradigm shifts just keep redestroying and redestroying and redestroying the cosmos. And there is something about that becomes mystical. There's now people saying that data and images coming in from the new Webb telescope are challenging the Big Bang. And what's funny is even if they come out with some 100% refutation of the Big Bang theory, there's a lot of people who will not ever be able to accept that for the rest of their life because they are too wedded to the idea of the Big Bang. But then that's really funny to me because the guy who first proposed the Big Bang, I think it was Teilhard, was a French priest. And people were saying, "Oh, you just came up with this Big Bang theory because it's creation ex nihilo. We see what you're doing. You're just trying to sneak Catholicism into modern cosmology." And now the Big Bang is the thing that is embraced by atheists and secularists because it's the most iconoclastic, or at least it was.
Things are always changing. I think that it's good to have your worldview shattered. I think it's good for the soul. I think everyone should have their entire worldview shattered at least one time, maybe more. Keep going through it. Just become addicted to that purging and rebirth feeling. But those telescope images were really interesting to me because a number of them actually related to some esoteric ideas that were really cool. Like the up close photo of the sun, it looked like lion fur, which made me think of Leo. The up close Jupiter stuff is the color that Jupiter is astrologically corresponded to rather than how it looks from a distance. Like it's not that orange tone. There was like blue through it and greens. And I was like sitting there and I was like, esotericism is vindicated. I feel like my Twitter followers thought I was probably going a little schizo for a few days. I was like, we're right. This proves we're right.
They were seeing it all along.
Yeah. On a religious point of view, I actually like the idea that we revolve around the sun because then that justifies pagan sun worship. So I am hoping that stays in the science so that I can be like, we worship the thing we rotate around. Come back to sun worship.
See, I think we went wrong when we stopped worshiping the moon.
I think that's an important one too. I think we should worship the moon. I think that there's a reason why people like the moon.
I just like it because I get sunburned easily. So
yeah, I relate to that. I also have a problem with getting sunburnt. If hyperstition was real, I feel like that might, when I was starting to prepare this episode, I was like, if hyperstition is real, this is gonna like impact people's theology. And the more I've been talking, the more I've been thinking that might not actually be true, and hyperstition might actually be in line with most theology.
Yeah, and I would say like, is hyperstition real? Hyperstition, if you proved it was real, that would prove that it was fake. I think it's one of those things where hyperstition has to be liminal. Otherwise, it becomes like any other type of magical thinking. So if you just prove that any mental, if you just prove that any abstract desire or thought that you have can affect material reality or something like that, that's not really any different than any type of magical thinking.
Yeah. And I mean, I'm a hardline believer that your thoughts and all that can impact reality, but I also like to swim in the woo a little bit.
I think with hyperstition, it's more like the woo. Do machines make the woo real in a new way?
And I think they might. I always have been someone who's kind of averse to the techno occultism stuff. I don't quite like it, but the thing is with it is when I look at it, it's like one of those it annoys me that it's true type situations where there clearly is like an esoteric dimension to technology. I just don't like it, but I think eventually I kind of have to just like swallow that pill and just, be annoyed at it while being like, maybe you have a point.
Have you read any like cyberpunk novels? Any of the classic cyberpunk novels like Neuromancer, Snow Crash?
I should probably read some. I really haven't read much, to be honest.
I think.
I read a lot of the CCRU stuff, and the Green
Mm,
Book, the main one, the CCRU writings, was like this very interesting combination of theory and fiction. And after a certain point, I was like, I'm just going to read this for what it is and kind of just like go on the ride. It's kind of how I
so
felt.
I think that with CCRU and Land and that whole milieu, that they were trying to kind of combine the vision of cyberpunk into actual theory. And so you get something that's theory fiction, and you can define hyperstition as just being the combination of theory and fiction. Um, I think that's another way you could define it or look at it, where things that are fictional um, are constantly inspiring people to do things in real life, or they inspire real life um, inventions, this sort of thing.
Oh yeah, and I
But
think like the most obvious example of this for people who are into the esoteric stuff, and I was sort of discussing this a little bit, not in these terms, with Space Reaction on an earlier episode of the show, is the Inferno. I think that like in the modern, especially Protestant Christian view of the world, a lot of the imagery and visuals of hell and how they see hell, like if you look in certain Christian mystic texts, there's these ideas where you visualize hell and you meditate in it and you sort of use that to understand the theology of hell and what that means as a Christian. And I feel like a lot of that is literally just Inferno becoming like, which was written not to be like a religious text, has become a religious text because people have taken it that way. And I think
mm,
it's become one of the most literal examples of that.
so okay, but what's interesting about Dante's Inferno is that one is that it is supposed to be a moral text. It's supposed to be teaching you how to get back on the straight path. And also, a lot of it is very political because Dante is airing a lot of his political grievances under the guise of hell. So I guess he was doing a little theory fiction himself.
I think it
Dante
kind of
Dante had
was theory fiction. I think it
a little
was.
a little Landian maybe in that regard. But what was I thinking? Okay, so what's interesting though to me about Dante is that he also loves Rome and loves paganism and is clearly struggling with the fact that he misses the underworld of old. And he has to reconcile that with Christianity. And it's been noted that, at the beginning of the Inferno, he's invoking the muses, the ancient muses, to help him write. But as he gets further through the Divine Comedy, his prayers become more and more Christian. But I would say, one, it's interesting if we were going to talk about Inferno as hyperstition. I mean, I'm sure this should be someone's thesis paper, but one would be it's a return of the ancient past and being utilized in the present, right? It's deep past and deep future because it's Dante resurrecting the pagan underworld, but now understanding it in a Christian light. Um, I think that there's a hyperstitious aspect there. And then also, it's funny because it's the Protestants who wanted to sever all connections with the pagan and I think Jewish roots of Christianity, that they wanted this pure, imageless, purified, simplified form of Christianity, a more rationalistic form of Christianity. Maybe that's me being a little ungenerous to Protestantism, but that's generally how I see it. But it's funny that these medieval ideas that officially I don't even think that they would like still creep into their view of hell.
Oh, absolutely. I think that Protestantism is really it's very informed by it's sort of Enlightenment values and Enlightenment thought, and it's kind of seeped deep into it. And I do think Protestants see them as the rational Christians. If you look at Protestant critiques of other religions, I mean, a lot of it boils down to they see them as primitive, as antiquated, as overly mystic, and they sort of look down on them and that, and they're like, we have thought it all out, we have figured it out. But the thing is, I don't really think you can fully do religion in a hyper rational way, because it's religion, it's esotericism that's always going to come back to personal experiences. And so I think any attempt to hyper rationalize religion eventually kind of collapses a little bit. But I won't go on a huge Protestant rant.
We've talked about it, yeah.
I have my thoughts on the Protestants. The only thing I would, I guess, disagree with your analysis of Protestantism is I would say early Protestantism definitely tried to sort of disconnect from the Jewish roots, whereas I think there's a strain in modern, particularly American Protestant thought that's sort of trying to reconnect that in a very weird way. But that's still, I would say, not kind of on the fringes of Christianity.
Oh, I think after World War II, there was a desire to at least half embrace the Jews and half embrace Israel and Zionism. But you have to keep in mind they're supporting Israel because they see Israel as being part of prophecy. You know, there's lots of. I mean, I would hear Protestant people talk about this when I was a kid. This idea that if we get enough Jews back in Israel, that will flip the switch, right? It'll Israel will weigh enough that it'll hit the second coming button, and it'll trigger the end times, right? So another form of accelerationism,
Yeah,
right?
well, you're describing this, which I've heard this theory many times. I was like, is this just accelerationism? Is it, I guess we could call it ZPACC, Zionist Protestant Accelerationism. The Zionist Protestants, they're pulling a Shabbatain and they're trying to accelerate the end times by
they're not, they don't, and yeah, it's very, I knew some weird, I knew this Mexican dude who got super into meth, very
Landian of him,
getting super
honest.
into meth, lived out in the woods for a while, and then he became like he became like a Christian Zionist, and he'd be like blowing a shofar and stuff, but then would also be, you know, talking about how everyone who doesn't believe in Jesus is going to hell. So, I mean, whatever. Yeah, you're right. There were more Old Testament. There was definitely an aspect of Protestantism that was very Old Testament inspired. However, I just mean this idea. There's this idea of Protestantism, of Christianity being almost synonymous with pure reason. And so any of the aesthetics or historical connection to Catholicism or to Rome or to Judaism or to paganism or all these other traditions that had strongly informed Christianity for at least 1,000 years, they were trying to purify themselves from.
Yeah, really the only place in the world that's Protestant that kind of pulled some paganism back in would be in Scandinavia. And that was not for a religious standpoint. It was kind of a like cultural, loving our culture
Yeah.
thing.
Well,
Everywhere
they were
else
the
has been like purged so hard as Protestant, whereas Catholicism and Orthodoxy, you can sneak a little paganism through the back door and kind of get away with it.
in the case of Catholicism, it was barely sneaking. I mean, basically, the whole structure of the Catholic Church, uh, like where do nuns come from? They come from the Vestal Virgins. Where does the Pope come from? The Pontifex Maximus. I mean, all of this stuff. It's like they basically just made metaphysical Rome via Christianity, and then I think with the North, it's like they were the last to convert, and
Yeah,
so the Christian roots there are the shallowest.
yeah. The last country to convert was Lithuania, strangely
Mm.
enough. And if you look at Lithuanian Christianity, because I went towards a rabbit hole when I was sort of talking about the conversion, researching the conversion, and going on my little rant about why we need to undo the conversion, even though I know that's not really going to happen. Trust the plan, guys. Trust the plan. We are going to hyperstition the overturn of the conversion into reality. Trust the plan, my friends. Trust the plan. Lithuania held on to it the longest. And if you look at where paganism had their strongholds till the end, it was mostly rural areas, and it was everywhere that was geographically far from the center of Rome, pretty much.
Yeah, yeah. Um, I can't remember. It was like they didn't stop praying to the Great Mother until like the start of the Middle Ages, before the Catholic Church was finally like, you have to say Mary. You can't say um, uh, whatever it was, Magna Mater. Like you, they were still praying to the great goddess like several centuries into Christianity.
Yeah, and there's always a little bit of paganism in your modern religion. It's in all of them. You can't escape it, no matter how hard as you try. That's why we need to just embrace it and go hard. But I'll not go on my return to paganism spiel too hard this episode. Sort of the final thing that I kind of wanted to discuss with you. Obviously, hyperstition and technology are heavily linked, and Nick Land's worldview is very, very attached to technology. It's really he predicted a lot right, and I mean my general thought on Land is that he diagnosed things really well. I don't agree with his solution, but he certainly saw things in a way that kind of came true. I guess maybe he manifested that.
A
Um,
lot. It's yeah. Something I mentioned is that if you read, especially Meltdown, because that's the one everyone should read at least once, is Meltdown. Um, there's a lot of things that just sound oddly topical, even though it was written in the early '90s. And I would say the number one thing, it's not any particular detail that Land predicts, although you can connect those dots if you want to. It's that I think his whole style of writing was him trying to speak the language of the future the way that he thought Deleuze and Guattari were speaking the language of the future. And that's this weird, discombobulated, leet speak technoglossolalia. I actually think a great example of this is Alex Jones, where the guy just consumes an unhealthy amount of information, and then he just lets it rip. He's like the Oracle of Delphi. And he gets a couple things right. He gets a couple things wrong, and then a lot of the things he says are just a complete mystery. But what I would say is that is when you live in the information age and you live in an age of just endless technologically mediated language and symbols and hieroglyphics 24/7, that's the consciousness that you enter. You enter the consciousness of Meltdown. You enter the consciousness of Alex Jones. And this is the thing, they'll never admit it, but there's a lot of stark raving liberals who they do what Alex Jones does. They consume a bunch of media that they more or less trust, and then they don't think about it too critically. They just mush it all together and they just let it rip. They go online and they let it rip.
I
So
think
in
that's
that,
honestly almost every single person with a Twitter account.
yes, a little bit, at least a little bit, and some more than others. But that's how I would want to think if there's anything I can get across to people who are listening to this, because I know this is a weird subject and it like gets very hard to talk about. And I feel like I don't always do the best job of explaining all of it. But to me, that's the key takeaway. You want to think about this in terms of language. Hyperstition, accelerationism, like all of it manifests in language first. And because we live in an age of technologically mediated language, it's going to take on this increasingly paranoid, claustrophobic, semi-mystical form.
Language has a lot in it that can do a lot. I mean, I think anyone into esotericism should understand this, right? There are multiple languages where the letters of the language have specific meanings, and like whole systems of mysticism, looking at you, Enochian, where you essentially say things. You just say things in a specific way and things happen. And I think that that doesn't end with just these old mystic systems. That can expand into many more things.
Umberto Eco had this awesome take where he said that Mac is Catholic because it's all pretty and you're not supposed to actually know how it works. You just use it, okay? Very user-friendly, very aesthetically pleasing. And then he said PC is Protestant because it's all about, your interpretation of how the computer work, and it's all, it's open source and you can look at the code and change the code, and it's more individualistic. It's more open text. And then he said source code and like Linux, he's like, that's Kabbalah, because Kabbalah is all about how Hebrew is like the mystical foundation of the universe. I think it's a good way to look at it.
It's all a little more complicated than it seems, I guess. Could be like the thesis of the entire show. What do you think people get the most wrong about Nick Land?
Whether they love him or hate him, I think they take him too seriously.
How do you think he should be taken then?
I think that Philip K. Dick would call himself a fictionalizing philosopher. I think you should see Nick Land as a philosopher who's fictionalizing.
Do you think that Nick Land is right about the future and nothing human will make it in the near future? Do you think nothing human will last until the near future?
I think we're already in it. It's like we've already become dehumanized and we've already become extensions of machines and algorithms. This is why I say, like, people who are mad about Google Glass because they don't like the idea of someone wearing a camera on their face that can record them all the time. I think a lot of that anger at people wearing Google Glass was because that Google Glass was an acknowledgement of what had already happened. And like I said, like hyperstition, accelerationism, it manifests itself in the present, and it's already in the language and in the mediums through which we speak to each other currently. So it's already happened. We've already become dehumanized.
I think you're right. I was ranting about how I'm scared about transhumanism the other day, and all the replies were like, we're already living it. And I was like, oh, you're right. Then I felt a little black pilled. How do you not go full black pill while reading Nick Land?
Yeah, I think, see, that's what I'm saying. I would don't take it too seriously, because if anything, see it as a form of catharsis. But also think, you could have a crazy future. You could have a crazy future where we have like robot arms and legs, and the atmosphere is gone, and this sort of thing. But maybe we'll all be like bug farmers, and we'll all spend a lot more time face to face, and there won't be a social media anymore because it won't be profitable. So, and maybe that'll be the return to paganism. Maybe not the one that you envisioned, but maybe that'll be the one that you get, Georgina.
It may happen. That probably is a bit more likely. I've been seeing, this is probably the most ironic sentence in the world. I've seen neo-Luddism become really cool on TikTok, which there's something weird about that sentence, but it is happening.
But there isn't, right? Like we were talking about, like it's like the mode, what I think, like big picture, Nick Land, acceleration, all that, it's about a conflict between deep past and deep future. And as we talked about, like when you were on my podcast, we were talking about Witch Talk and all of that. It was precisely people being pushed inside because of quarantine that made them want to look, made them want to find some new connection with the mythical past, with nature, with unplugging and this sort of thing. So it's like there's a dialectic there, right? It's precisely because you're constantly looking at a fucking screen that the highest fantasy becomes, how could I return to nature?
Yeah. And it's interesting because there's no true way, like the idea of fully returning to nature, it's not going to happen, right? There's sort of this fantasy I think some people have of like we're going to get rid of our phones and we're all going to like dance in the fields and I don't
Well,
know,
if you're true,
destroy the electrical grid, I don't
I
know.
was going to say, it's returning to nature is a fantasy until somebody actually destroys the electrical grid, in which case then it becomes just a matter of time.
Well, I guess I always kind of think that the whole like returning to the nature past thing is a bit like something we need to blend with the future to make happen rather than just return. But I guess you are right about the electrical grid. I guess that would make it happen. So for YouTube terms of service reasons, I am not encouraging anyone to attack the electrical grid. If you do this, I have nothing to do with it. I did not hyperstition that into reality. This is my disclaimer. That would be a Twitter kerfuffle I don't want to deal with. I guess that wouldn't be a Twitter kerfuffle because there'd be no electricity.
Yeah, you can't try canceling me now, bitches.
What do you think is something that will hyperstition in the future that has not hyperstitioned yet?
Well, maybe I could just connect it to what we were just talking about. Like I've been saying a lot that the no phoner is coming, and that the no phoner has already appeared at the top of society, and that the no phoner will appear at the bottom of society very soon. People that'll be like the new vegan. That'll be the new Jehovah's Witness. That'll be the new Mormon, or the new Amish will be people who are being like, I'm going phone free. And I saw Aziz Ansari, and he was saying that he's switched back to a dumb phone, right? And I feel like that's the first step. You can see that's a nodal point where you can see it's very easy to see that the world can tip that way very easily. People will finally get sick of it. I think in the future people will see smartphones and the unlimited access to smartphones, especially among young people, that will be remembered as the cigarettes of our time.
Do you think it's gonna like how long do you think we've got with our phones before we all get?
I think it depends on the economy. I think it depends on a couple of things, but it's not hard for me to imagine. Eventually, people will start to figure out the rich people don't raise their kids with phones, and there's a good reason.
Oh, so you think it's gonna become like a social like class and caste thing? Who uses their phone and who doesn't?
It already that has already happened, because the Silicon Valley people already raise their kids without phones. They send them to nice little private schools. I can't remember, what are those Rudolf Steiner schools called?
Oh, the Waldorf schools.
Waldorf.
I feel like I could have a whole discussion about that because Rudolf Steiner has huge ties to theosophy, and those schools have actually a really huge dose of theosophy in them. I feel like I should discuss that at some point because
because Steiner actually, that's how it is now, but Steiner didn't really like theosophy. It wasn't Christian enough for him.
He liked theosophy but made his own version of theosophy because there were things he thought were wrong about theosophy, so he made like a new theosophy essentially. But it is still kind of philosophical.
There wasn't this I just got done reading Gary Lockman's biography of Rudolf Steiner, and but it talks about how, like, whatever, Steiner was always had to be at odds with everybody, and so the Theosophists liked him for a little bit, but because he was he was like, no, Jesus was really like the best thing that ever happened, and all religions actually come from Jesus. And the Blavatsky people didn't really appreciate that very much, because they wanted to do the whole deconversion thing. They wanted to do the return to Indo-pagan whatever.
Yeah, theosophy is very, like, I would say it's Indo-European is probably the term. It's a strange one. Theosophy really, love it or hate it, right? People have a lot of thoughts about theosophy. There are some things in theosophy that I think are really brilliant, and there's some things in theosophy that make me want to pull my hair out. It was incredibly influential in Western theology and philosophy. It was important whether you like it or hate it. I think people should understand Blavatsky. People should read Blavatsky, even if they end up disagreeing with her on pretty much everything. She's kind of important. And Steiner, I would say, is as well, because hippie Silicon Valley parents are secret Steinerist and are educating their kids in his system of thought. Not in a conspiracy way, in a he started a school system way.
I just want to say I don't think they're actually I don't think they actually care about Rudolf Steiner or care about anything like that. It would actually be a lot cooler if they actually knew anything about Rudolf Steiner. I just think they.
I heard. I was reading articles about it. I heard that they don't teach it to the kids, but like the teachers have to learn about it. Apparently.
Yeah. But the Waldorf schools are just kind of known for being they're nice schools, and I think they put a lot of the occultism and the Rudolf Steiner woo. I think they put a lot of that on the back burner. It's more just about these sort of kind of hippie. It's more just like a hippie school. But in any case, I don't know how many of them actually go to Waldorf schools. I'm exaggerating, but I just kind of know, as someone who lived in the Bay Area for a while, I kind of know that. I definitely know that the techies are sending their kids to schools without phones and this sort of thing. If you like this kind of stuff, you can follow me, schizotopia.pod, on Instagram, at Brain Origami on Twitter. Also, Schizotopia Podcast, available wherever podcasts are available. Except for maybe YouTube, because they keep taking my shit down. But
really, they're taking your stuff down? I didn't know that.
Well, I lost a couple videos.
Listen to Schizotopia. It's a good show. I went on it a while ago. That episode's really chaotic, but if you want to listen to it and have a little, it's more chaotic than this one. So if you want even more chaos, I did go on that show. Thank you for continuing to listen to the show. I am Georgina Rose. You can find me on like every platform ever. I don't know if there's any I'm not on. I'm on Instagram. I'm on TikTok, unfortunately. I'm on YouTube. I'm on Telegram, Twitter. Twitter is my most chaotic. I'm on Substack, Twitch, Odyssey. I don't think there's any like platforms that people actually use that I'm not on. I have a Patreon and a Ko-Fi if you want to support me to enable me to continue having these conversations, and to pay my bail when one of you eventually attacks the electrical grid. But if you are a high enough patron and you opt to have your name read, it's optional. I will read it out. And here are all those people: Shiraz, Emil, Neva, Lilith, Jonah, Nauseated, and Lee. Thank you so much for being continued supporters of the show and being willing to let me read your names on the show. That takes a little bit of boldness these days. Anyways, have a lovely night, day, mid-afternoon, mid-morning, wherever it is, wherever you are. And thank you for listening to the Postmodern Iconoclast. This has been our show. All right.